Hi, KO community. For the grade 2 to 3 teachers in the early literacy project. I just want to really quickly just recap tonight on the stuff that we started talking about last week in the webinar, and really this is just on the literacy screening. You don't have to watch this whole part of the video. The main thing that I want you guys to be focusing on this week is looking at the oral reading fluency task and the days task that are listed below. Those are going to be the two screeners that we're going to be learning to look at how basically the basic skills of reading as well as reading comprehension. Now again, as you know, reading is a complex skill. The brain has to process a lot of information from saying those letters on a page to be able to actually come up with words. And many different parts of the brain are being used together, and hence why reading is challenging to learn. As I think I've said in other talks to you guys, oral language is very natural, but anybody can basically learn how to speak as long as they're put into a speaking world. However, to be able to learn how to read, that is something that for many have to be directly taught. Again, we're looking at the skills of reading. Both reading and writing are made up of a whole set of component skills, and it's not good enough just to say a person can't read or a person can't write. We have to understand what those component skills are. Today, what we're really focusing on in terms of the assessment is with the oral reading fluency is going to be looking at the reading fluency and expression. And for this to be able to take place, for oral reading fluency to take place, a person has to have mastered concept of print, letter sound, and phonics, as well as phonological awareness. So those three building blocks have to be in place for oral reading fluency to work. And that's one of the really nice things about oral reading fluency is we can quickly go in and assess one area and know that other areas are in place. Now, if oral reading fluency is problematic, then we'd have to test down to be able to look at what part is coming apart. For those who are in grade 2, if you're finding that your students are struggling a lot with the oral reading fluency task, then you might want to look at the non-word reading task, or nonsense word reading task, which is described in the kindergarten to grade 1 section. What it gets at is the ability to decode. So it's looking at the phonics element and seeing how fluent is the phonics development coming along. The ability to decode unfamiliar words by reading words that are not real words but follow the same rules of English. So that's just a kind of a little tidbit there. Now, again, why does this all work? Because reading, it develops in stages. Early on, you learn the sounds of your language and learn how to speak. Then in kindergarten, you start to put spoken words to letters, so the sounds of our language to letters. Those letters, learning how to decode those letters becomes fluent in grade 2 and into grade 3, and that's where you guys are mostly working. And then kind of at the end of grade 3 onward is where literacy really has to have developed. So that's why for especially the stage 2 students, we're looking at the oral reading fluency, but also because especially in grade 3 we're moving into more comprehension. Students are beginning to move from stage 2 to stage 3, so reading comprehension really is beginning to emerge, and the days task is a reading comprehension measure. These are just examples. So that pseudo word reading, or the nonsense word reading, this is the one for the grade 2 students you would use if the student is unable to do the oral reading fluency task. This is just to kind of show you how the stages emerge, and the days really begins to emerge at the beginning of grade 3, oral reading fluency early on, and actually the nonsense word should actually go into stage 2 a bit. Now, one of the things that we do with all these tests is we look at cut points. And what a cut point is basically a way of indicating who is at risk and who's not at risk for a certain skill. And basically, through research, we establish cut points to say if you're below a certain cut point, then you are at risk. And if you're below another cut point, then you are probably having you're severely at risk. And whenever we're looking at cut points, we always are looking at not the number of, we're always looking at data that is normative. So we are always looking at how I am doing compared to other individuals my age. And when we're doing that, when we're talking about looking at normative data and cut points, we don't talk about percentages or number of words right. We talk about percentiles. And a percentile is how did I do in comparison to the normative group of my age. So if I scored at the 65th percentile, what that means is I did as well or better than 65 out of 100 individuals my age. So if I lined up 136-year-olds in this room and I scored at the 65th percentile, that means I did as well or better than 65 out of those 100 individuals my age. So it's a percentile is a relative position. Typically, average runs between the 25th and the 75th percentile. However, when we're looking at cut points, we often look at below the 20th and below the 10th percentile. Below the 10th percentile is the extreme range, that's severely at risk for having difficulties in the future on that skill. And below the 20th percentile is your at risk. So what's one of the ways that we kind of think about our classrooms then when we use screeners like this is to be able to quickly identify who are the most at risk, who are at risk, and who are kind of typically developing. The other thing screeners allows us to do is also identify who's at the top of our class, because that top 10%, so if we were to kind of look at the 90% plus group over here, those individuals usually don't need much of our intervention. They actually just do well by exposure, by providing them with the opportunity to learn and then letting them go off and do it. But it's the below the 20% and definitely below the 10%. These are the students that we're going to need to spend much more time with. And in general, when it comes to the strategies that we'll continue to talk about in the early literacy program here, is those are the students who are going to need multiple repetitions over the same units again and again and again, because they're going to develop at a slower rate. And again, as kind of we've talked about in the passing on the Matthew effect, basically students who are at risk, which is shown by the bottom line, though their scores or their literacy skills continue to develop over time, they don't continue to develop at the same rate as proficient or those above the 20th percent. And usually by the end of grade 3 and going into grade 4, this is really where we see the significant difference in literacy scores, that those who are in the at-risk or below are significantly less than those typically, because it's at this point you really have to have the ability to read to continue to learn. Up to and into grade 3, you're really learning how to read. From grade 3 onward, you really need to know how to read to continue to learn. And so this is an area where the two groups really begin to diverge. So with these different things, we have the different types of assessments that we can use, and the main one that we're going to be using is the oral reading fluency, which is quite easy. And again, I have a video on how to use it, developed by the videos by the makers. But basically, you sit down with the students, you have your stopwatch, and you ask them to read out loud to you. So you tell them, I'm going to show you a passage. I want you to read this passage out loud to me for 1 minute. You start your stopwatch as they're reading. If they come to a word they don't know or they can't figure out, you put a slash through it. You then give them word and you continue on. And when you get to the end of the 1 minute, you put a bracket to indicate that you're at the 1 minute, and you tell them to stop. If it takes them more than 3 seconds to say a word, then you indicate that, and you count up how many words they read right in 1 minute, and that's your main score. The second score that is on the oral reading fluency is a retell score. And what the retell score is, at the very end, once you finish them reading out loud, you basically say, tell me back in your own words what you just read. And you basically indicate how many meaningful words they say in that retell, and that is a rough indicator of comprehension. More that you can recall that you just read, more likely that you understood what you just read. But again, there's a better video on this that goes in a lot more detail. Once you have these numbers, you then go to the assessment booklet or the main manual, and in the main manual they have these wonderful graphs that talk about the different cut points for the at-risk status. And the way that you read this this diagram is you have two numbers in each row. So if we're looking at the oral reading fluency, the first number is, if you're above that number, then you are at or above that number, then you are above the 20th percentile. If you're at or above the second number, then you are above the 16th percentile. So if you're below 23, that means you're below the cut point, and therefore you are below the 20th percentile. If you're below the second number, then you are below the second cut point, which means you're below the 10th percentile. And we have the same thing for the days as well. So this is just to say that this type of information is highly correlated with overall academic success and later achievement measures. And the other thing that we can do, and we'll talk more about this as we go through, but it's also progress monitoring. With all these tests, you can administer them more than once because there are more than one passages developed at each grade level. And by administering this test over time, especially with your at-risk students, you can actually plot their development. So one thing that we can do and talk about is how do we go about developing our goal line. So based on our assessment data, we should be able to set a goal line for our students. And then based on the interventions that we're giving and kind of constantly monitoring them, then we should see that they're kind of developing along that goal line, that they should have the same slope. In this indicator right here, we can see that the students start off at that same slope, but then something happened. They weren't making the same types of gains that we would expect them to. So therefore, the dotted line shows that we changed the intervention. Again, they start making some success, but weren't moving as fast as we would hope. Change the intervention, and suddenly we see them making great gains. So we can talk about this way of using progress monitoring to really identify those students who are struggling the most within your classroom. One of the key things that we always want to do, or things that we want to understand, is why is this student not moving? And by having weekly or even bi-weekly data about how students are progressing, that really tells you if you need to change something up to try and help that student move along, because often it is something within our instruction or the way that we're interacting with that student, or there's some other big variable out there that's impacting that student that is preventing them from learning. And so progress monitoring really allows us to see, is learning taking place or not on a typical skill or specific skill that we're looking at. Great, thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to everybody in a week.